Megan Elias. I am Professor of History at Queensborough Community College, and I'm the Project Director for the Foodways and Humanities Project. In this project, students in history classes at John Jay College and Queensborough Community College will do research into historical foodways. So they will be looking for descriptions of food from the long ago past, and they will try to come up with recipes from that research. And then we take the recipes to culinary arts students at Kingsborough, who then attempt from these recipes to prepare something edible. This project came out of a conversation I had with a colleague at John Jay College, Fritz Umbach. Fritz and I both like to teach about food. We like to teach about the role of food in history, and we were sort of commiserating over the fact that we don't have any kitchens to teach in, and that we could read about food with our students and talk about it and even bring in things for them to taste. I like to bring in salt for my students to taste, for instance. But that the students were never getting to make food, and they were never getting to understand the process. And the process is really very important. That's something that changes a lot, in fact, over time.
I first turned to using food in the classroom to resolve a problem I was having teaching, and that was the growing mismatch between scholarly developments in the field and the needs of my students. Increasingly, scholars of Latin America and global history discuss these very abstract concepts: global silver flows, energy regimes, and whatever the scholarly merits of those concepts, they can deaden a classroom because they remove why students care about history in the first place, which is the lived experience of flesh and blood people. So I wanted to move from something concrete and familiar, the foods they all knew from their homes, to something abstract and unfamiliar.
So I had the idea to team up with colleagues at Kingsborough College, Kingsborough Community College, who teach culinary arts. And the idea was for the research that students in history classes do to get made. So the recipes that people are researching could turn into real food, and that for the culinary arts students, that they would get to see that the thing they're making in the moment actually has a history, that the food has a past as well. So for this project, we decided to use the Columbian exchange as a focal point. So we're looking at food before Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, and then food after he arrived, which is really the Spanish effect on Native American food. So we're looking at some interesting foods: tonic water, mole sauces, chocolate, tamales, and chuños, which are these kind of unusual freeze-dried potatoes.
So the usual student product in a history classroom is an essay. And I wanted something that would move beyond that, but would still require all of the analytic skills that a student refines in a history course. And so the students use all of those familiar sources, primary documents from the time period, the broader historical scholarship, but use it not to produce an essay, but instead to produce a recipe. And this requires all of the analytic skills that we want to refine in the classroom, but changes the output, and changes the output in such a way that it could intersect with the culinary arts program at Kingsborough Community College.
The class I'm teaching is culinary improv. And I think when we first imagined this class, it was very much like these game shows. Students come in, they're assigned raw materials in a game format. They're given X number of hours to cook something. And sometimes the challenge was because there was a really odd combination of ingredients, or sometimes the challenge would be that they'd be midway through something and they would lose an ingredient, or you'd have to work in a team in a new way. And I've been trying to add other ways of thinking about what's the improvisation material, like what are we improvising with, and as chefs, how do we learn? And what's sort of the new matter that you bring into the kitchen every day? So when Megan and Fritz asked me to take part in this project, I was very, very excited, because all of a sudden there's the opportunity to treat historical material as part of the ingredients that you add or that you incorporate into a dish.
One of the great things about having students write recipes is that the primary sources weren't written as recipes. They have to extract and repurpose the information that's contained in those primary sources to come up with something that looks like a recipe.
They were given a paragraph, and actually in most cases just a sentence, that described a dish. It could be as simple as a sentence that said, rabbits were prepared by adding the rabbit meat to caramelized onions with these 10 ingredients, and cooked. Okay. So we had talked about this, how, you know, a good chef can take that and interpret this. And what they did was they sat down with that one-line description, and they had to think about proportion, and they had to think about technique, and they had to think about interpreting something so that if it says fried, do we mean deep fried, do we mean pan fried, do we mean sauteed? And they prepared 3 dishes as a result of that. Sometimes it's really challenging to think about how we bring these different themes together pedagogically, but I think today was really a success. The food was delicious, which I'm really pleased with. I think the students really understood the challenge, which is really important as well. It makes me feel that these types of collaborations in terms of using historical sources as a foundation for teaching cooking is really, it works. It's exciting. They liked it. It's something new. It forces me to work harder. And I think in the end it also illustrates something that we talk about very often, but we don't give students a chance to, I think, experience from the ground up, which is that chefs all draw their inspiration from someplace. So whether they hear about Mario Batali digging into Italian regional cuisine, or they hear about Rick Bayless and the types of restaurants that he runs where he really digs deep into Mexican culture, the advantage of doing this kind of work is that students get a little bit of that experience of noticing that these recipes evolve out of sort of a dual understanding. They have culinary skills, they've got the technical skills, they have the vocabulary, they have the methods, but they're also learning how to take this other form of information, which is not presented in a way that's a cookbook, it's not a recipe, it's not presented in the way that usually culinary information is presented to them, and they're merging these 2 sorts of information together and coming up with something that they can make happen. It's a hands-on experience, and then hopefully it teaches them, you know, as they move forward in their professional careers, how great recipes emerge.
One of the recipes that we're using in the Foodways and Humanities Project is tonic water. And the advantage of using tonic water as a focus for student understanding is that it places a Latin American substance and puts it into global perspective. Without tonic water, which relies on substances from Latin America, there would have been no European colonization of Africa and much of Asia.
And this entire history of European colonialization in malarial regions is captured in a cocktail.
Today we learned about how to make tonic water. I thought it was very interesting how without it, many of the colonies that we know today wouldn't exist, especially Africa.
When we talk to students about learning history through food, it's obvious that they're now deepening their understanding of historical processes, and that they're taking things they know from their lived experience and weaving it back into time. And not just weaving it backwards chronologically, but expanding geographically their understanding of the interrelationships between regions and peoples. Some recipes excited the students more than others. Those involving cacao really took off in the classroom for at least 2 reasons. One, they're more familiar with the substances than others, but 2, it allowed us to get at the idea of what is authentic in foodways. So one student brought in a chocolate bar that advertised itself as authentically Mayan. But of course the ingredients included sugar and milk, which wouldn't have been available in the 15th century. On the other hand, chuños, the freeze-dried potatoes that we hope to use to explain the eco-imperialism of the Incan Empire, where they took advantage of different geographical space and climates, was much less successful. It turns out that you can't actually make chuños with a refrigerator. It requires the Andes.
So the funny thing about this class was that I actually talked very little about food in class. So I never gave my students the kind of wonderful lecture about the history of mole that Professor O'Donnell gave her culinary arts students. What I did instead was I gave students a larger historical background, and then I led them to a secondary source about food history and just sort of let it happen and figure out what would jump out to them. What foodstuffs did they find significant? What foodstuffs did they think were evidence of the author's argument? So I was trying to kind of draw out the skill of finding historical argumentation, but focusing on food in this case. I had asked the students first to read an article about Native American life before the Spanish arrived, and then what sort of what the Spanish brought with them culturally. And then they read an article called Chiles, Chocolate, and Race in New Spain, and it's by Rachel Loudon and Jeffrey Pilcher. And this one student I was really intrigued by because she wrote about rice pudding.
I saw that a lot of the foods mentioned within the article, it consisted of things such as rice, and I believe it was also milk in there. So I'm used to having rice pudding as a dish at home.
So by bringing rice with them from Spain to Central America, they were bringing a food that had resulted from their own colonization, rice. And they bring this with them. And then Priyanka, the student, had responded to the presence of rice in this article by thinking about her own family's history in India, where rice pudding was an important part of their foodways. And it was very frightening in some ways because I knew that Babette wanted to cook mole and I didn't know if my students were gonna ask for mole. But indeed they did, so in some senses, right, I chose the right sources for them. But they also came up with a lot of other interesting things like this recipe for rice pudding that I wouldn't have imagined. And so I'm glad that I left the door open for their own creativity and for them to find their way into food history.
There's a really deeply personal satisfaction that comes out of working with food. And the more you know about the foods that you're working with, I think on those bad days where you feel as though you're ready to give up the whole industry, having those little stories about how cod got depleted or why the British in India drink gin and tonics, it just gives you a little bit more of that matter that keeps you going, and it's really fun. There are plenty of days you walk into the kitchen, it's a bunch of cowboys in there, and like cooks are cowboys. We come in, we chop meat, we throw things on the grill, we love the adrenaline, we get really excited about the rush of service. But then you also realize like you're feeding others, but the reason why we get into food in the first place is there's this very deep satisfaction and this need to tell a story through it. And it's not just the story of, oh, I've got great technical skills, oh, I've got all of this knowledge under my belt. It's because I think for my students, I hope, are starting to realize that they're also telling a very personal story through the foods that they're cooking, and this kind of historical material is starting to help them make that connection, and that's what gets me very, very excited.
So I went into this definitely unsure that it would make any impact on students' understanding of the past or of food or anything on earth. I was willing to recognize that it hadn't changed anything. And then of course really excited and pleased when I found that when I asked students to write about whether they thought it was worthwhile to learn about food in a history class, they really responded enthusiastically that they felt it was. And I gave them a lot of room, to be honest, and to say, I just don't think this works. But just to give an example of what one student said, this is just an excerpt from her essay. She wrote, I believe it is worthwhile to think about food in a history course because everything has a history. All of the food we eat now came from somewhere. Foods were very important elements in cultures and also had social and economic impacts on society. And that last sentence is what I really wanted people to understand, that food wasn't something that happened outside of economic life, outside of society, but that it was part of that it was even a determining factor in many ways in historical events.